Evening, everybody. First of all, many thanks to Jeff and Grant for having me this evening, and can I commend you on your regular evenings with authors here. I'm very happy to have been invited, and thank you to all of you. I can see that I wasn't expecting so many people, so thank you for all of you and for turning out. And obviously, it's a testament to how interesting Emmanuel Macron is as a man that the room is as full as it is. I thought in planning for this evening, I would be, unlike Emmanuel Macron, try and give you a fairly short speech, which would explain obviously my book and the idea behind it, and then we could try as much as possible afterwards to take some of your questions. I'm sure you all have things you would like to know about Emmanuel Macron, and I will do my best based on the last 12 months of research to answer those. I thought I'd explain sort of how I started with the project and what it was that made me want to write about Emmanuel Macron. I was living in India. I came back to live in Paris it's my third stint living in the city in 2014, just as he was named economy minister in the last Hollande government. And like a lot of journalists here, the foreign journalists, we were all aware that there was a very ambitious, very charming economy minister that no one was quite sure where he would end up and at what point he would become a sort of major national figure. But it was very clear that he had very large ambitions. And I think all of us, our interest peaked in the course of 2016. There were sort of three major events that you would all be aware of. There was the first one when he founded En Marche, which was in April, and he came out and created this movement, neither of the left, neither of the right. No one was quite sure what it was going to achieve. He then, a few months later in August, steps down from the government, and then in November declares that he's going to run for the president, to widespread scepticism that frankly nobody in Paris thought at that stage they had any chance. In the interest of full disclosure, I was absolutely among those people who thought that Emmanuel Macron had no chance of becoming French president in 2017, and it was the first point that I started thinking there was potentially something going on was about the time of December. He did a big rally in Paris at the time, and there were thousands of people, and it was a real sort of moment that I think he did. You know, a lot of the Parisian journalists and those of us who are known as sort of the metropolitan media elite, as we're referred to nowadays, of which again I have to full disclosure admit that I'm part of. I don't think any of us then, this rally certainly helped us to take him more seriously. But I think one of the big one of the big lessons for the metropolitan media elite of Brexit and Trump, where obviously we were thought to have failed in pointing out that both of those decisions, the election of Donald Trump and Brexit, were going to happen, that the media was seen as having failed to have foreseen that. And one of the criticisms was that we spent too long in the cities. So at about the beginning of January, I went out to see an Emmanuel Macron rally in Brittany, and it was astonishing at the time. I must say, I sort of came back from it talking to everybody around me, sort of saying how bowled over I had been by the sort of enthusiasm, the level of organisation, that all these people, even in a small town in Brittany, had come out on a very sort of rainy, cold January evening to listen to Emmanuel Macron. It was very clear at that time that there was a real gap between what people were writing about in the media and about his prospects and actually what was happening on the ground, and that this movement that had started only sort of 9 months before was really starting to pick up momentum. And the other thing was that I was, it's important for a biographer, was just intrigued by him as a man, and we're roughly around the same sort of age, and sort of seeing him up on stage, having done everything he had at that stage he was only 38. It got me thinking about how on earth do you sort of get to that position where you're running for president age 38 of a country like France. And it was at that point that I started my research. I went back home, I drew up a huge chart, mapped out roughly the periods of his life, and started reading and writing down names of people that I would contact subsequently to build up the narrative of the book, which I did. Some of them were kind enough to respond to me saying no thanks, but no thanks. Some of them were extremely open. Some of them asked for the president's permission before, the candidate's position before speaking to me. But overall, I was able to sort of create a very detailed narrative that had people at all the different stages of his life, right up to when he started En Marche. The title of the book, as you know, as Jeff explained, The French Exception, the idea behind that was there was two ideas. obviously the French accession is a reference to the idea of France, that how it sees itself as a country that is exceptional, going back to its revolutionary history. And I think France showed itself to be an exception in 2017. Again, as we know, this is a time of rising right-wing nationalism, of populism across the world. And France really obviously bucked that trend in electing Emmanuel Macron. And the idea of the French exception was twofold. There was that sort of France and the French history, but also, of course, Emmanuel Macron. And I firmly believe that he is an exceptional figure, not just in terms of his political talents in becoming president, becoming France's youngest ever president, but also in terms of what an unusual character he is and how he marries so many different things. He's the small town man from Amiens who made it big in Paris. He's somebody that once wanted to be an actor. You speak to some of his school friends who knew him around sort of 17, 18, everyone thought he was going to be a writer or an actor or something in the arts. He's somebody who flirted with the idea of becoming an academic. He becomes a philosopher's assistant, but he was also an auditor in the finance ministry, an investment banker. He's a real kaleidoscope of a man, and that was a real challenge for me in writing the book. Was actually, he's so unusual. How do I sort of make this man? How do I present him in a way that we can relate to? And I think it is quite one of the challenges. Is it's very difficult to relate to Emmanuel Macron. The other big side of that is that obviously in his personal life, as you all know very well, with his relationship with Brigitte, his former school teacher, 24 years older than him, he is a very, very unusual man, and for that I found him fascinating. And obviously, if you're going to embark on writing a biography of somebody, I definitely recommend that you're fascinated from the start, because you inevitably plunge into that person's life and slightly occupy that person. He certainly occupies your life from day and night. So when I started writing the book, it was very clear to me that there was something was happening in France. It was a very important political story, but there was also this character that I was intrigued by. I wanted to get very much to the bottom of. The other part of the title is the extraordinary rise. I think that's is clear, and it was also the idea of the extraordinary rise was me personally being interested in, as an individual, that you could almost see the book as a sort of self-help guide to achieving your ambitions. I mean, he's quite extraordinary how he goes about constructing his career, and as I said, Emmanuel Macron is a self-made man to the extent that he comes from. He's a middle-class, comfortable family in Amiens. I've been to his house where he grew up. It's a very nondescript, very comfortable middle-class house in Amiens. But there's really nothing in the early life of Emmanuel Macron. He goes to a private school, but not a particularly exclusive one, that would indicate that he becomes that he would become France's youngest ever president. And how he goes from when he comes to Paris. He builds up a network of people that enable him to really accelerate his career in a way that no other French politician has been able to up until now. The last part of the title is obviously the extraordinary rise and the risk. And what do I see as the risks of Emmanuel Macron? And I think the first risk, I think, is for France, that he's made an enormous bet with the French people. He's an extremely unusual politician for France. I think there's a tendency to look at what happened last year and somehow imagine that France has, and certainly when you look at the parliamentary results afterwards, he was elected with a very large majority in the second round, and then an overwhelming majority of the parliamentary elections. There's a tendency to look at France that it's in some way fundamentally changed, that it's become at ease with open markets, it's become pro-business, that it's become pro-European, it's become liberal. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think France is at a stage where it's experimenting with a very different sort of president. And I think his programme, he's essentially sort of proposing that he will introduce his medicine of reforms, which he's pushing through very fast now. And his bet with the French people is that in a couple of years' time that this will have improved their lives. And I think there's a huge risk that the medicine either doesn't work or is seen to have not to have worked. And a lot of French people, and we saw already in the election last year in the first round, nearly 50% of people either voted for the far right or the far left. And I think that the risk obviously in France is the failure of Macron's presidency. Is that it reinforces those currents which I consider to be a danger for for France. There's also a risk for Europe. I'd quote Emmanuel Macron on this, and he says that he's the conclusion, I have no other choice but to make Europe work. He said, the failure of Europe will be mine. It's the responsibility I took during the election. That was something he said just before his election. And I think he's very clear that he's made a huge bet, again with the French people, of saying, Europe is our future. And our sovereignty, we're prepared to share our sovereignty with our other European partners, but the bet with the French people is that is going to be seen as something that is an advantage to them, that makes them feel safer, that makes them able to, makes them feel reassured at a time when there's a huge amount of anxiety about the effects of globalization. Again, it's a gamble, it's a bet, and I think he has to show that the results in the next few years that French people feel better about Europe. Again, I think there's a huge danger that if that isn't seen to be the case, that reinforces the Eurosceptic currents that are as strong in France as anywhere else. It's about 50% of the country who are opposed to the European Union or indeed in favour of pulling out of it altogether. And the risk, obviously the third risk, and this isn't a risk related to Emmanuel Macron, but he is right now, as Jeff said in his introductory remarks, sitting around the table at the G20. When you look at the other world leaders, there aren't many that are able to articulate a vision of a world based on cooperation, on multilateralism, on a rules-based international system. And I think Emmanuel Macron has a huge responsibility and role to play in forums like that. In my personal opinion, I think the world is a safer place having him at the table. So those were my introductory remarks. That was my outline of the book, I wondered if there was, obviously it's hard to know exactly what your level of interest and knowledge is already, but I'd be very happy to take any questions that you have. If there's any, I thought in the interests of gender equality and the Me Too world we're in, we should take a question from a woman first if possible, and alternate it as much as possible throughout the evening. Is there do we have any? If not, no, we'll start with I think the first thing, I mean, she's 64. I mean, she's not, which is, she's not.
People, yes, it happens. Shit happens.
Anything happens. I mean, certainly you're in a higher risk category being 64 than being 40. I would only say that she is an absolutely essential part of his life. They are extremely close. She is somebody who has supported him throughout his career. She's somebody who serves as a sounding board for him in terms of how he should. She's a political sounding board. She's not just a wife in the background, a sort of traditional political wife, who's managing his private life in the background. She is somebody who is involved in, who has strong political views on a lot of things. So she has a vital role in his life. I'd imagine he would react like most husbands who love their wives would be devastated. But I don't see any reason at 64 that we should be too concerned about that. But yes, please. The Fillon question is interesting, and there are people who believe that had the scandal not happened to Fillon, that there's no way that Macron would have become president. It's obviously, it's impossible to know. I personally think that based on what based on what was obvious from the grassroots at that point, that, as I mentioned, the trip that I went to in January, there was a huge amount of energy that was already invested in the En Marche movement. If you look at it at the beginning of January, before the scandal that engulfed François Fillon, those people who don't know, this was the scandal about his wife being paid for years as a parliamentary assistant, despite no evidence of the fact that she had worked for him. Macron had several advantages already. If you look at the polls around that time, he was by far he was considered to be the most trustworthy, and he actually had far more positive polling ratings than Fillon did at that stage. And he had by far the most motivated and largest network of activists. So I think there's a good chance that even if François Fillon doesn't implode halfway through the campaign, that Emmanuel Macron still wins it. It would have been much tighter, but I don't think it's I don't think it's impossible. On the question of sort of how he managed his career, I mean, what's obvious throughout Emmanuel Macron's rise is there's a huge amount of luck in it, and there's no doubt. Emmanuel Macron read Machiavelli, as a student. He did a master's in philosophy, and he studied and wrote a thesis about Machiavelli. And I think he absorbed one of the main messages of Machiavelli in The Prince, which is all about your attitude to controlling risk and fortune. And Machiavelli recommends that the best approach to controlling unexplained or unforeseeable events is to be bold and to make decisions. He talks about fortune as a woman. Actually, it's a very un-PC thing to talk about now, but that has to be sort of beaten to be controlled. And what he means by that is that the best way is to take decisive action. And Emmanuel Macron displays that throughout his career, that when he sees an opportunity and opportunities crop up, he seizes them. I'll give you there are a few times when he I'll give you a few examples. Obviously the Fillon thing is a stroke of luck. He also, one of the biggest breaks in politics is when he starts working with Francois Hollande, and this is in 2011. It's in the leading up to the presidential election in 2012, and at that point nobody thinks that Francois Hollande is going to win. There's a range of socialist candidates to stand in 2012, and everyone thinks that Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who was at that point was the International Monetary Fund head, everybody thinks that Dominique Strauss-Kahn is going to win it. Hollande has a very small campaign team working for him, and Macron decides to join Francois Hollande. He's one of 4 or 5 people who are advising him. And at that point, there's really no reason to do it. It was a very sort of, it's the opposite of what most people would have done in his situation. And a couple of months later, Dominique Strauss-Kahn is arrested in New York over allegations of having raped a maid in a hotel in New York. And of course, his campaign then falls apart. Francois Hollande becomes the president, and Emmanuel Macron becomes one of his leading advisors in the Elysée Palace. So, and that pattern of Emmanuel Macron having openings but going for it is something that reoccurs various times. When he becomes economy minister, it's the same thing. He actually steps down from the Elysée Palace. He decides he wants to create a startup. He goes to California. He looks for funding. He goes to London. He's determined to go into business. And what happens actually is there's a rebellion in Francois Hollande's government at the time. The economy minister and the education minister come out and criticise him over his economic and Europe policies. Have to resign. They need somebody out of the blue, an economy minister. They've got a pressure. The press is on their back. And Emmanuel Macron sort of happens to be there and gets the call and takes up the opportunity. So there are various times in his life where, as I say, it's a mix of his talent in obviously as an individual, but that's not enough. As we all know in life, talent can only get you so far. You then need to have the breaks, and when the breaks come, you need to be able to take them. And he shows an absolute skill at being able to do that. Gentlemen. It's a strange. I think everybody, and I assume you were among them, assume that Macron and Donald Trump wouldn't really get on. They couldn't possibly have anything in common, and it's, as been shown, that wasn't the case. And one thing that Emmanuel Macron is very good at is sizing up people in front of him, and he has sort of emotional intelligence where he will pitch his. How he talks to people and pitches his message. He will modify that very skillfully depending on the people who are in front of him. And I think he's done that with Donald Trump. Now they actually have things, surprisingly, they have more in common than you would think. For a start, they both see themselves as political outsiders. So I think they were able to bond over that. I think Emmanuel Macron also has a real understanding of business, and I think that helped with his relationship with Donald Trump. And Emmanuel Macron has a history of one of his early mentors, and again he has this consistently throughout his career. He has relationships with people who are several generations older than him, and one of them was a property developer who was much older. So he knew the business, and Donald Trump was definitely not the first sort of billionaire or more elderly billionaire that Emmanuel Macron managed to seduce. So I think he also, he played him very well in their first meeting. I don't know if you recall, they first met in Brussels at the NATO summit, and there was a very memorable handshake, which like Macron sort of goes in and he anticipates the sort of the Trump lunge and crunches him. And I think it was, you know, it was a very clear message right from the beginning that Macron wasn't going to back down, that he was aware that he was, you know, dealing with a man who respects strength, who likes winners, and that Macron had to sort of portray himself in that way. And I think he's been very successful in doing that. He was certainly the Obama campaign of 2008 certainly informed a lot of the things that Emmanuel Macron did. They used political consultants who had worked with Obama in 2008, and particularly when they were designing their door-knocking campaign, which they did. They were in contact with several of the Obama campaign managers at the time. So there was definitely links over that. I think you can see in the way that Emmanuel Macron, his relationship with the media is also based on the model that Barack Obama used, which was he doesn't give many interviews, he distributes a lot of stuff through his own channels on social media. He's very successful at revealing things about himself that make him look good, but doesn't necessarily engage a huge amount with the media. I think Obama used that model. Obama actually had very bad relationships with the White House press corps. You know, he was seen as very much keeping them at a distance, and Macron is doing that. In terms of the wider, how influenced is he by America? I think there's no doubt that he admires American entrepreneurship. You know, you hear it very often in the way he talks about, you know, making France as much more of a startup nation. Who's very, you know, impressed by Californian startup culture. It was absolutely no coincidence that was where he went when he was thinking of setting up his business in 2014. Sorry. Afterwards, I wouldn't overemphasize that as him as an American. I don't think, you know, I think the comparisons probably end there. I think he's very much in the sort of European centre-left political tradition. I think that's very different and doesn't exist to the same extent in the US at the moment. Well, I think he has, like most recent French presidents, I mean, he sees there are two tracks to his foreign policy. There's a very strong European dimension to it, and there's also an international dimension in which France has different priorities. And first on the Europe question, the best way to imagine it is that essentially Emmanuel Macron thinks that sovereignty in the 21st century is not something that is, in Europe in any case, is something that should stop at national borders, which is where he completely differs from Marine Le Pen and any others on the nationalist right. He sees sovereignty as something as the way of basically a country being able to project its power and protect itself. And he sees the European Union as being the best way to do that. So what he's proposing is a lot further transfers of French sovereignty and sovereignty from all the European member countries to build up the European Union as a federal structure. And that means that, in theory, Europe will be better at protecting its border. Europe will be better at imposing its conditions in the global trading system. Europe will be better at sharing information about cross-border terrorism. Europe will be better at fighting climate change. And all those big sort of questions, he sees French sovereignty as being much better shared with Europe rather than acting alone as a country. So that is essentially Emmanuel Macron's views on the European Union and where his priorities are. Afterwards, there's an international, as you mentioned, dimension. France has always seen itself as having a big role to play in the world. Emmanuel Macron's very aware of the responsibility he has now as Europe's really sort of preeminent leader in global forum. So he will continue to act as somebody who wants to uphold the global system as we know it, and act as a counterweight to a lot of the more unilateralist, isolationist, authoritarian governments. Now, whether he does that, I think so far what his strategy has been, and particularly as you mentioned, he's travelled a huge amount. Africa is slightly different, which I can talk about in more detail, but his strategy so far with the likes of Donald Trump, with Vladimir Putin, with Erdogan, with Narendra Modi in India, the first part of his mandate has really been building up those relationships. It's about opening dialogue, meeting those leaders, which he's done repeatedly. The big question, I think, is what he does with those relationships afterwards. I mean, where is he able to exert influence globally? If you look at Syria, he doesn't really have. France and Europe more generally is a bit part player in that conflict. If you look elsewhere, obviously climate change, he's trying to work with China to push that as much as possible. But there are other, Libya as a conflict, he's intervened in to try and find a solution rather unsuccessfully. So I think the returns on his very active, almost frenetic international diplomacy, and what I mean by that is outside of Europe, at this stage, are fairly limited. I think he's a voice of reason, but whether that voice of reason produces results is very much an open question. So. I think the big difference between, and you mentioned the difficulties he had, this was his, just for those of you who don't know, is the law that bears his name, which he pushed through in 2015, it was actually a fairly modest law when you look at it. It did things like create private bus lines and change qualifications for some protected sectors and things, but it created a big backlash because it was seen as being sort of more, as François Hollande at the time, as being far too business friendly. I think the big difference between François Hollande and Emmanuel Macron is a question of the strength of the political mandate. François Hollande was elected on a very left-wing programme and then tried to govern from the centre-left. Emmanuel Macron has been elected with a mandate which is very clear, which was repeated throughout his campaign, which didn't change crucially between the first round and the second round. And I think that gives him much more legitimacy as a political leader than François Hollande ever did with trying to do some quite similar stuff. You're right to raise the speed with which everything's been done, and I've had various meetings with people in the Elysée recently, and one of the things which comes out in all of the conversations is an obsession with speed. And what they want to do is and we can see it in the number of different areas that they've opened up at the moment, the areas that they want to reform. There's the civil service, there's the SNCF, there's the education system right through from primary level up to secondary. They're talking about changing preschool education. There's so many different areas that they're acting on simultaneously, and I think that's down to there's two reasons. The first, I think, is a tactical reason that they realise they have an opportunity now. The opposition in France is weak, the political opposition and the trade unions. They realise they have a limited window after the election to act. And the other thing is political, and it's a question of their political survival, I think, is that they realise that they have to produce those results. And you can only really produce results when you're reforming things like the education system or even changing labour law. These are things which take time to work through the system and actually produce a result. And if you're going to, he's going to be looking, he has elections coming up, the European elections of 2019, he has municipal elections the year after, and then obviously there'll be presidential elections again in 2022. If he wants the results of what he's putting in place now to be evident to French people, he has to do it quickly. So that's a crucial consideration. Absolutely. I think you've put your finger on one of the biggest vulnerabilities of Emmanuel Macron, which conversely was one of his biggest strengths during the election campaign, was that he did create this incredibly dynamic citizens movement which carried him to power, and they're now in a stage where they have to transition from a citizens movement into a political party. I should add, though, that even though it was described as a citizens movement, it was always a very sort of top-down organisation. It was very clear that this was a vehicle for Emmanuel Macron. People were invited to propose ideas and so forth, but it was actually very, very controlled around Emmanuel Macron and a few people. Although the people who joined had the sensation that they were joining something that was actually a participative, that was a citizens movement. It wasn't. The difficulty they have now is they're very much a political party, and that requires a certain amount of top-down decision-making. If he doesn't get it right, he's going to have, as you say, very serious difficulties, and I think it remains a very shallow political organisation. It doesn't have that deep-rooted sense of identity that people have from being a member of the Socialist Party or a member of the Republicans Party or the Communist Party, whatever it is, that the people feel a sense of identity. Part of that issue is the political identity of the movement is unusual, and the second reason is that it takes time to build that up. I hear regularly from a lot of the people that I spoke to during the campaign, that I met as I was on the campaign trail, and my sense is that inside those people who went out and knocked on doors and gave out leaflets, that really took part in making En Marche the political force that it was, a lot of those people are very unhappy at the moment, and they see that the party is being too controlled by a clique of people around Macron. And that's a serious vulnerability, not just for the local and European elections which are coming up, but also the presidential elections further along the line, if he wants to escape the trap of Sarkozy and Hollande, who were both one-term presidents. So, lady at the back. I think that you're right. They've been very interesting to watch the relationship between Macron and Merkel, and we're all very aware that if Europe wants to move forward, that relationship between those two, the motor, as it's usually called, at the heart of the European Union, that motor sort of has to be. It has two cylinders, and both cylinders need to be firing sort of at the same rate. And I think there's part of the relationship. What I was interested in initially was how Merkel would receive Macron, who came in as being this man with a big vision for the European Union. He came in very much with his blueprint of what he wanted to do. And Merkel had been somebody, particularly under François Hollande, where she had very much been the senior partner in that relationship. And we've seen to a certain extent that it's reversed, that Macron is very much the lead partner in that. What happens now? How weakened is Merkel after the elections in Germany in September? I think certainly to a certain extent she's had to make compromises to create the coalition that she's created with the SPD, the centre-left party in Germany. I think from Macron's perspective, I think he's very happy with the German government. They've made a very clear commitment to much of his agenda, but I think that there are significant differences. A lot of that is around financial risk sharing. Macron wants to drive a lot more sort of financial integration, particularly in the banking sector. We see really the two approaches. The German approach is extremely nervous about taking on more liabilities, financial liabilities. You remember that we're just coming out of now of a series of crises where we've seen hugely costly bailouts of countries across the Eurozone, particularly in Greece, and the Germans are understandably leery about taking on more. I think Macron will get a part of what he wants, but like everything in the European Union, it will depend on a compromise and fudges. But I think that motor is important. I do think it's moving in the right direction. I think there are some differences, but I think we are in a phase where the European Union is moving and might move quite fast. I think probably like all of us, he's got his strengths on a personal level. His strengths are also some of his weaknesses. I mean, he's as I mentioned, he's somebody that intellectually obviously is extremely impressive, and has been really all the way. He's marked out as an exceptional student right from school. But we see that occasionally tip into arrogance and being slightly self-regarding and certainly condescending in a lot of his remarks. I think that is that is a weakness. He's also somebody who's incredibly impatient, which can be a good thing and explains how he became president at age 39. But the downside of that is sometimes taking on a little bit too much, moving too fast, not preparing things sufficiently. And I think there's a danger of that with some of the economic reforms now, that this emphasis on speed, obviously that comes with the cost of the amount of time you can spend working out the important details of legislation, which I think is and pushing that through. So I'd say those are those are two things. As you say, there is an anecdote which I recount in the book where he's advising Le Monde and is caught out as an investment banker, essentially sort of advising an investor and not declaring it to his clients at the time, which he was caught out and made to look rather foolish, and which was perhaps evidence of his ruthlessness, ambition, and wanting to sort of get on. But yeah, I'd say certainly the arrogance and the impatience certainly can be weaknesses. He does play piano to relax. He's somebody who, yeah, he went to the Conservatoire in Amiens when he was a schoolboy, and he's an accomplished pianist. He uses it to relax. So sometimes he can sort of. I spoke to people who said he'll sort of, if he's frustrated or angry, he'll sort of bang out music on the piano rather noisily. So it is something that he has access to a good one in the Elysée, as you can imagine. Somebody right from the beginning who thought that Brexit was incredibly foolish. Even when he was economy minister, he would go to London. He was on the record several times advising Britain against taking that decision. On a basic level, he just can't understand it strategically. As I described before, on his views in the European Union, he very much sees the world and Europe as needing to act as a bloc rather than as individual countries, and sees France's strength as going through the European Union. Brexit is a decision, obviously, taken that moves Britain very much in the opposite direction. Considers that Britain should be is much stronger on its own, which is, we're seeing the consequences of that now. So I would say that for a start, that he doesn't understand it on a strategic level. The decision having been made, how does he react to that? And I think first of all, he sees it. He smells opportunities everywhere, and particularly, not so. If you take the financial sector is just one of them. He sees obviously Paris as being a place that will attract some of the jobs which might move from the City of London over to continental Europe, or the destination is Ireland. He's there very much opposed to the idea of any post-Brexit trade deal, and France has taken a very hard line on this, that wouldn't include a free trade deal for financial services. So there will be, if France gets its way, and obviously, as you say, it's a negotiation that's done at the European level, but France is very much working to create some sort of barrier between the City of London and Paris. And the India, I think, is underlines sort of how he sees it also as creating opportunities in the wider world. That he went to India last week and spoke about France being India's main strategic partner in Europe, rather than Britain, which obviously for historical reasons has always played that role. And I think that the Brexit is part of this pattern that has opened up opportunities for Emmanuel Macron internationally. It's led to British politics being almost entirely tied up by Brexit, and all the energies of the government being put into that one subject. I mean, Britain, it pains me to say it as a Brit, but is just a non-existent, almost shrinking presence internationally, and some of that space Macron has exploited very, very skillfully. We mentioned Merkel before as well, who is because of the election result, which was inconclusive when her party was scored much worse than expected, that she as well is a diminished international character. So I think Brexit has created economic opportunities, which Macron will be keen to exploit, and it's created diplomatic opportunities that he is very eager to and has stepped into. Hope that answers your question. In terms of social policy, I mean, he's very much on the centre-left. I mean, his main break from the Socialist Party is that he's rather like New Labour, is very much, he's from that school of thought, which is all about tackling inequalities and offering, he's into the equality of opportunities rather than equality of income. So his whole social policy is built around not taxing rich people to then redistribute. It's about trying to create opportunities for people from deprived backgrounds. And I think that I would say his main social policy is in deprived areas, which are called ZEP plus areas, which are areas that you'll see around Saint-Denis, around Paris, or in other smaller towns. It's all about putting new resources into schools there. So I think that's his main policy, which as a Brit, you'll remember education, education, education being Tony Blair's mantra when he came to power as New Labour, and I'd say that Emmanuel Macron takes a similar approach. Elsewhere was there anything in particular on the?
Large-scale long-term unemployment figure.
it's all about that. That's particularly about training. One of his campaign pledges was to create this new fund of 15 billion euros to invest in adult education. And obviously there's nothing particularly new in that approach. That the problem is that governments have enormous difficulty in putting it in place. I think there's a consensus amongst governments that we are now living in an era when long-term stable jobs are rarer and rarer, that each of us coming through will possibly need to reskill at different times in our careers to adapt to technology as that happens. Emmanuel Macron believes that the only response to that is investing in adult training and being able to better orient people towards professions that provide employment opportunities. Now that's a very easy thing to say, and I think most governments would agree that's a fine objective. Putting that in place requires a huge amount of resources for a start. It also requires retraining of how do you accompany people if somebody loses their job, how do you advise and channel that person towards either adult education or to other jobs which may or may not be in the area that they live in, or the sector. And I think that's a huge organisational challenge, which is different to the financial challenge, which is putting sufficient resources to make that into something that actually has an impact. Well, he's again, as I said before, the focus of his international diplomacy has been in the first 6 months was all about building relationships so that he has a dialogue with all these different, we can call them strongmen leaders around the world, of which Vladimir Putin is Exhibit A. He invited Putin very early in his term, so he came to Versailles, and Macron sort of wowed him with a state visit at the Versailles Palace, and he was incredibly firm, and I think it echoes his approach with Donald Trump, was that he called out Russian propaganda in his meeting with Donald Trump, with Putin, and it was a remarkable moment that you saw him sort of saying this in front of Putin to his face, and Putin doesn't give much away, but I'm sure I detected that he sort of slightly squirmed as Macron said this. So I think that was a strong start to it. You remember, of course, that there were allegations made by people in En Marche and the French government at the time of Russian interference in the French election. Macron hasn't followed up on that, which is interesting. I think their relationship is they talk very regularly. They talk on the phone. Again, it comes back to my question of how much of Macron's energy that is invested in building a relationship with people like Vladimir Putin. What are the results of that? And I don't see much so far that would indicate that Vladimir Putin listens to Emmanuel Macron more than he listens to anybody else. The interesting thing as well is mentioned that if he completes just this quinquennat, it will actually be the job that he's done for the longest in his life, which gives you an indication of sort of how fast he has risen. So if he did 10 years as president, that would be almost twice as long as any other job he's done. What would he do afterwards? I think he will become a writer. I think that was his first. He's somebody who he wrote a book as a student, which is called Babylon, Babylon, which was a story about Spanish colonialists in South America. And he says that only a couple of people have seen it, a publisher who I tried to track down, who sadly has died, and Brigitte. But this manuscript is stored away, and there's another detective novel, so I gather, of there's potentially 3 or 4 books. The figures vary. So I think that's certainly his ambition. None of those of Babylon, Babylon was rejected by the publisher, and he was very disappointed as a schoolboy. So I certainly think he'll do a lot of that. I've no doubt he'll probably have lucrative public speaking engagements as well. But we'll see. I think he was somebody who interestingly said when he was what would have happened had he failed in his bid to be president. He was somebody who said he wasn't going to stand for Parliament. Which was interesting. So it was an open question about what he would have done had he come third in the first round of in April last year. I think there's a we're coming up to March 22nd, as you might know, has been announced as a big day of demonstrations and strikes that the rail unions have announced they're going to take part in. Potentially going to be other strikes with other public sector to unions. I think it's sort of the next. This is sort of round two of what is likely to be a multi-round battle between Macron and the unions. Round one was September, October last year when he pushed through the labour market reforms, and I think there's speculation about whether this is going to be 1995, which is the last. I don't know if any of you were in France at the time and remember that, which was the last time really that France was paralysed by the trade unions. We had about 4 weeks of rail strikes. People were walking to work. There was no cash and cash machines. I don't see that happening. I think that if you look at at this point, the polling numbers are very much in favour of what he wants to do. The most controversial element of that rail reform is removing the special status of the rail workers, and there's a large majority of people that think that is justified as a decision. I should warn you that there's a large number of French people as well who believe that we're heading for another 1995. But anyway, I don't think so. I think as I said before, I think he has the mandate to do a lot of this stuff. The trade unions in France have progressively weakened since 1995. If you look at the membership numbers of trade unions, it's fallen in an almost straight line since then. And there have been laws as well. Nicolas Sarkozy passed a law as president that required public services to provide a minimum service even during strikes, and I think that takes out. That's a major blow to the trade unions. That they're actually unable to paralyse public services in a way that they could before that law. So I don't see Emmanuel Macron backing down, even in the face of what could be a lengthy dispute over that. But we'll see. You can tell me if I'm wrong. So. It's certainly a novelty as you say, as a French president who speaks English. I mean, most of previous French presidents have had fairly appalling language skills. If I say, I should say that as a Brit, as not any British Prime Minister has been better, but he is interesting that he does have very good English. He's used that effectively. You mentioned the message that he released on social media after Trump's decision to pull out of the climate change agreement, sort of make our planet great again, which was very widely retweeted. I think that it changes the vision of France of having a president who can speak in the world's medium of communication. I think it's interesting that he's an English speaker, but he's also taken a very strong position on defending la francophonie, which is something that's coming up. There's going to be announcements on that at a summit that he's very much into promoting the French language. And the ties between French-speaking countries. So he does speak very good English, but he's still very much in the mould of French leaders that see la francophonie as something that's essential. I think En Marche was an incredibly middle-class movement. Overall, it started off as something that was actually sort of very diverse, and by the end of the campaign, it was very clear that this was, which was very much a middle class movement. The backbone of it, I think, was people of professional classes, of small entrepreneurs, of small business owners, and those are the people who backed Emmanuel Macron. I think if he fails to produce results for that constituency, which is the majority of the country, there's like most developed countries now, that what we consider to be the middle class is by far the biggest political constituency. Those are the people that he has to deliver results for, as well as the ranks of the unemployed in working class. In theory, his medicine should produce results. It should. I think there's an increased confidence generally in France, which obviously the economy thrives on confidence, that businesses need to have some sort of visibility on what is going to happen. They want to feel there's a government that understands their needs, and I think he's been very successful in projecting that. I think the tax cuts certainly send out a very positive message about France. That it's and it, as I say, it aligns France more with its neighbours. France has been a high tax. It takes either in terms of its overall tax take is one of the highest in either the first or the second highest tax take in Europe. So there was, in my opinion, there was a need to bring that down. In theory, all things being equal, this should generate more jobs. Those jobs need to be quality jobs. As we've seen, there's a lot of job creation in a lot of developed economies have been either short-term or very insecure, poor quality jobs, and I think that's obviously an issue. There's an unknown variable about how much does technology, of job-killing technology over the next few years, how much impact does that have on the French economy? Can the French economy create more jobs than those which are taken away by technological change? We know that, things like artificial intelligence are going to change many professions, and depending on which studies you look at, a large proportion of those simply won't exist in 10, 15, 20 years' time. So there's a huge amount of change coming. Whether Macron is successful in creating enough jobs that outpace the destruction of jobs elsewhere in the economy, I personally think that he will in the short term. I hope I'm right, but we'll see. It's an open question. Thank you very much for your